My name is Olivia Carter and I'm 34. I know what it feels like to be overlooked in my own family. At my brother's wedding, my name was nowhere on the seating chart. They pointed me to the back chair 13 at the kids' table. Balloons, plastic plates, a chair that wobbled. My mother lowered her eyes to fix her napkin. My brother looked away. I didn't protest. I took out my phone, said 3 words, and the room shifted before anyone knew why. A spoon hit the floor. A few screens lit up. A powerful man quietly stood and left. How could someone they considered invisible turn the whole party around? To understand, we have to go back to the years I was pushed to the margins. When I was 8, I learned that applause had nothing to do with effort. I had walked into the living room holding a small trophy from a spelling bee still warm from the stage lights, hoping someone in my family would look up. Jason was already there, telling one of his stories, the kind that had no real point but always made the adults laugh. I stood in the doorway with the trophy in both hands, waiting for my turn, but no one noticed. My mother leaned toward Jason. My father laughed and an uncle clapped him on the back. After a while, I placed the trophy on the mantel for them to see and went upstairs. The next day, it was gone tucked into a box in my closet. That was how it always went. Jason filled the room with sound and I disappeared into silence. My brother was only 2 years older than me, but from the start he was treated like the centre of the world. He had charm that adults adored. He could stumble through a story and people would cheer. I could bring home a perfect report card, and the reaction would be a distracted nod. Once in middle school, Jason brought home a C in math. Within days, my mother had found him a tutor, and my father praised him for working hard. That same week, I won a debate tournament. When I tried to tell them about it over dinner, my mother changed the subject, and my father asked Jason how the tutoring was going. It was like that over and over until the lesson settled in my bones. Being good did not matter as much as being seen. I was rarely seen. At Thanksgiving, one year I tried again. The table was crowded with relatives, food steaming in bowls, voices overlapping. I had an idea I was proud of something I had written for school. I opened my mouth to share it, and before the first sentence was out, Jason interrupted with a joke about his coach. Everyone laughed, even my parents, and the conversation rolled on. I sat back pushing cranberry sauce around my plate. A family friend leaned toward me and said, "She is the quiet one, isn't she?" The words were meant to be gentle, but they stung because I knew the truth. I was not quiet by nature. I had simply learned that when I spoke, no one cared to listen. My father was the clearest sign of how deep this ran. When Jason asked for help with college essays, 3 adults hovered over him checking every line. When I asked for help, my father waved his hand and said, "You will figure it out. You always do." To him, my competence was not a strength to celebrate. It was an excuse to give me less. He gave Jason opportunities, introductions, resources. To me, he gave silence. I stopped expecting anything else. Over time, I learned how to hide my disappointment. I still worked, still achieved, but I did it without waiting for anyone to notice. I collected awards and kept them in a shoebox under my bed. I studied late at night and told no one. I became the person who could handle things on her own, and because I could, they let me. They mistook my independence for lack of need. What I really needed was acknowledgement just once, but it never came. The older I grew, the clearer the pattern became. Jason was the future. I was the fallback. He was the public face. I was the one who made sure nothing fell apart. He was invited to the table. I was expected to clear it. At first I thought it was temporary, that if I kept working hard, eventually they would see. But the years passed and nothing changed. I realised silence was not only expected of me, it was the only way I could endure the imbalance without screaming. So I became quiet, not out of shyness, but out of understanding. Some tables were never set for you. You were only asked to make sure the chairs stayed in place. That was the truth I carried into adulthood, the truth that followed me into every family gathering, every company meeting, every moment where Jason's voice was amplified and mine was ignored. It was the truth that shaped me long before the wedding and the chair marked 13. That truth followed me into Atlas, the company my father built, and handed to Jason as if it had always belonged to him. From the moment Jason graduated college, he had an office with glass walls, a title printed on crisp business cards, and a seat at every table that mattered. I was still finishing school, taking shifts at a bookstore to cover rent. But even then, I offered to help. I asked if I could look at the books, update the software, manage a few projects. My father smiled and said, "We will call you when we need you." They never did. For years, Atlas ran on Jason's name and my father's reputation until the market turned and both began to crack. I remember walking into the Atlas office the first time Jason called me in. Half the desks were empty. Phones rang without being answered. Vendors had stopped delivering supplies because invoices were unpaid. Jason looked at me across the table with panic in his eyes and said, "I do not know what to do." It was the first time he admitted it. I asked for the numbers and what he handed me barely made sense. We had maybe 2 weeks before collapse. I stayed late every night, combing through expenses, cutting duplicate vendors, fixing payroll leaks, pulling together the kind of reports investors actually trusted. I made calls to people I had met quietly over the years, people who never saw me in headlines but knew my work was solid. They listened to me when they would not take Jason's calls. Slowly, Atlas steadied. Checks cleared, vendors returned, staff started breathing again. Investors signed off on new funds because they believed my plan would work. Jason went on television a month later, standing tall in front of the Atlas logo, telling the world how he made the hard choices that saved the company. I watched it from my office, the one with no nameplate, just a desk in the corner. He never mentioned me. The newspapers called him the young CEO who rescued his father's legacy. I read the article twice, searching for even a line that hinted at what I'd done. There was nothing. When I asked him about it later, he shrugged and said, "You know how reporters they simplify?" What he meant was, your work is valuable, but your name is inconvenient. That night, I sat alone in the office long after everyone had gone home, the lights humming above me, spreadsheets glowing on my screen. My chest was tight with the weight of it. I had saved the company, and they would never admit it. I became what I would always be to them, the invisible fixer, the person who cleaned the mess, so Jason could take the applause. It was not the first time I felt unseen, but it was the first time I understood how dangerous that silence could become, not just in my family, but in the empire they believed was theirs alone. When my father died, that silence became permanent. At the funeral, Jason stood at the centre of every circle, shoulders draped with sympathy, his voice carrying as if he had inherited not only the company, but the right to speak for all of us. I stood a few steps away close enough to hear the condolences, but never pulled into them. People came to me with polite nods, nothing more, and by the end of the day, I understood my place as clearly as ever. A week later, the will was read. Jason was named CEO of Atlas, without hesitation, without even a discussion. I was not offered a role, not even a temporary one. No one asked about my years of work keeping the company alive. The board met behind closed doors, and I was not invited. When the email went out to all staff announcing Jason's official appointment, I was sitting at my desk with a pile of reports I had written. That was how I found out the same way an assistant or intern would not, as someone who had built the plans that saved them. Colleagues stopped by my office in the following days with soft words like, "We know how much you contributed," or "It is just politics." Their voices were low, their eyes quick to look away as if giving me public credit would cost them something. Then the magazines came. Jason's photo was on the cover, his jaw tight, his arms folded, the Atlas logo glowing behind him. The headline called him the man who saved his father's empire. I turned the pages one by one, searching for my name. There was nothing. I read the article again, slower this time, as if a line might appear if I looked hard enough. Still, nothing. When I asked Jason about it, he shrugged and said, "Reporters like to simplify." I wanted to tell him it was not simplification, it was erasure, but I said nothing. I dropped the magazine into the trash on my way out and kept walking. Board meetings after that felt like watching a play I had already written. Jason stood at the front, flipping through slides I had once created, stumbling over numbers I had once explained to him. I sat at the back, listed as an advisor, never as a decision-maker. Sometimes I felt the words rising in my throat, the urge to correct him, to point out what he was missing. But I held them in. If they wanted me invisible, I would give them silence. For now. My father's death had closed more than his life. It had closed any illusion that my place at Atlas would ever be acknowledged. The board made their choice. The world applauded their version of the story. My colleagues whispered their gratitude in private and pretended not to know in public. I walked out of the boardroom one evening, my heels echoing in a hallway where my name had never been spoken, and I told myself one thing. From that day on, Atlas carried Jason's name, but it ran on my silence. That silence was exactly what Jason counted on when he introduced Charlotte Fairchild to the world, dressed in white satin and framed as our company's salvation. The engagement was announced at a press conference, cameras flashing, Jason standing tall, with Charlotte's hand on his arm, as if the two of them had been written into some fairy tale. Reporters called it a story of love and legacy, the perfect match between a young CEO and the daughter of a billionaire. I watched from a distance and felt what they could not see, because to me it was not a love story at all. It was a transaction. Charlotte was polished, elegant, her smile practiced until it seemed effortless. She charmed the crowd, but when her eyes landed on me, they were cold, sharp, calculating. I knew right then that she understood her role and she knew mine. Behind her stood Richard Fairchild, a man whose money had saved more than one collapsing empire, but never without taking something in return. He barely spoke during that first introduction, but his presence said everything. The real weight of this engagement was not in Charlotte's smile, but in the man standing behind her, the one who held the purse strings. What no one outside that room knew, what even Jason hoped I would never realise, was that Richard Fairchild had written a condition into the deal. The investment would only move forward if both the CEO and the governing co-founder approved the plan. On paper, that co-founder was me. My name written into legal documents years ago, hidden in the fine print, waiting for a moment like this. I found out from a lawyer who had worked quietly with me before. He called one evening and said, "They need your signature for this deal, and without it, nothing goes through." For a moment, I was stunned. I had been erased from every press release, ignored at every meeting, silenced in every boardroom, and now suddenly my signature was the key to their survival. Jason came to me later, his voice steady, but his eyes restless. "Do not make this difficult," he said. "It is just a formality." That word stayed with me. A formality. As if I were nothing more than a name to scribble across a line, as if the years of saving Atlas, of carrying its weight when no one else could, meant nothing. I was not invited to the investor dinners, not included in the strategy talks. I was expected to show up, smile politely, sign, and disappear again. They believed my silence would last forever. But as I held the draft contract in my hands, my signature line empty and waiting, I realised something they had never considered. They thought I was a formality, but I was the one thing they could not move forward without. And that truth would change everything. I learned how fast that truth would move, the morning an email landed in my inbox by mistake. I almost ignored it because the subject line looked routine, a simple signature confirmation that could have been from any assistant. But when I opened the thread, I saw Charlotte's name at the top and a line that stopped me in the middle of my breath. Once she signs, she is irrelevant. I read it again slower, as if the words might soften or shift into something less cruel. They did not. The message was short, efficient, and completely sure of itself, a note sent to Jason that treated me like a door you close on your way out. For a moment, my hands felt cold and my chest tightened, not because the idea was new, but because the mask had finally dropped. They had dressed this engagement as a story about unity and partnership, and in one sentence, the truth stepped into the light. I was a box to tick. I sat back and let the room be quiet. I thought about the years I had spent holding Atlas together when it should have fallen apart. I thought about the nights I kept the lights on while Jason gave interviews about leadership. I thought about the boardroom where my name was never spoken, and the magazine covers that told the world he had saved what I had rebuilt. None of it hurt as sharply as that one line, because this time they were not pretending. They were telling each other exactly who I was to them, and they were confident I would never see it. The shake in my hands faded. I felt something I had not felt in a long time: clarity. I clicked forward and sent the thread to my private attorney with 2 words: hold everything. Then I set my phone down and stared at the draft contract on my desk, the page where my signature was supposed to go. For the first time, I did not see a demand. I saw a lever. They needed me for a single moment, and they planned to erase me right after. I would let them believe that plan was working. I would let them think I was quiet because I was obedient. I would give them the same silence they had always demanded, but this time it would belong to me. Jason called that afternoon. His tone was careful, the way people speak when they are trying to move you without making you aware of it. He said the lawyers were ready, that timing mattered, that this would stabilize everything for the company and for the family. He used words like we and together, but none of them included me. I asked one question: who else is on the thread? He hesitated and said it was just operational talk, nothing I needed to worry about. I told him I would review the final documents and get back to him. He thanked me for being reasonable, like a person talking to a problem that had just agreed to stay still. After the call, I walked through the office and watched people doing their jobs, unaware of the line that had just been drawn. Some nodded politely when they saw me, the same soft respect they offered a visiting partner. No one knew that the contract they were waiting on would not be signed, not today, not ever. I went back to my desk and made a list in my head. What they thought they controlled. What I actually controlled. The difference between those 2 columns made me feel steady in a way I had not felt since my father died. They believed the story was finished. They believed the ending was already on paper and all that remained was my name. But that email had changed the timeline. It had changed me. I did not reply to Charlotte. I did not forward the message to Jason with a lecture about respect. I did not ask for an apology or a meeting. I did nothing that would give them a chance to smooth it over and call it a misunderstanding. I chose to wait. Waiting is not weakness when you understand the clock better than the person who set it. I kept working as if nothing had happened. I took meetings. I reviewed numbers. I returned calls from partners who had grown used to checking with me before they made decisions that Jason believed were his alone. I said very little and watched very closely. Every hour that passed without my signature made their problem larger. They would smile for the cameras and tell each other it was handled, but the truth would keep whispering the same thing. Without me, nothing moves. I thought about sending Charlotte a single sentence. I thought about writing, I saw your email, and telling her exactly what I planned to do, but that would have given her power she did not deserve. She did not earn a warning. She earned my silence. That evening, when the building emptied and the office grew soft with the sound of vents and night traffic, I picked up the contract one more time. I traced the blank line with my finger and pictured the way everything would fall if I left it empty. Not because I wanted them to suffer, because I was done helping people who believed I was disposable. The pain from that sentence had cooled into something stronger. It was not rage, it was resolve. They had told me who I was to them. Now I would show them who I was without them. I turned off the lamp, locked my drawer, and walked out with nothing in my hands. By morning, I knew exactly how this would end and when it would begin. While they were busy treating me as a formality, I had been building something far from their eyes, an empire of my own. It did not start with a grand plan. It started with a quiet company under a plain name, a bank account I funded with my own savings, and a promise to myself that I would back people who were overlooked the way I had been. I met founders in places no one from Atlas bothered to go, small offices, above laundromats, tables in diners, off the highway rooms that smelled like printer ink and takeout. They did not have publicists or pretty decks. They had clear problems to solve and a kind of grit I trusted. The first team built simple tools that helped small banks spot bad charges faster and keep honest customers from getting locked out of their accounts. No one thought it was exciting. I thought it was necessary. The next was a shipping outfit that studied where trucks were getting stuck and redesigned the routes, so packages arrived when people actually needed them. After that came a woman who bought old warehouses and turned the ground floors into clinics and the upstairs rooms into places where people could learn a trade without going broke. I did not ask for my picture on a website. I asked for clean agreements, a seat in the room when hard choices came, and terms that protected the people doing the work. When things went well, we did not throw parties. We paid bills on time and made sure the light stayed on. Profits went back into the next bet, and then the next. Slowly the shape of it changed. A line turned into a net. A few points became a map. I began to see how these companies held pieces that fit together, and how together they could stand on their own without asking anyone at Atlas for permission. My name did not travel with them. That was the point, because invisibility can be a kind of shelter when the loudest people in the room are not on your side. Years later, when Jason and the board began to chase partners for speed and scale, they started knocking on doors that led back to me. A bank tool they wanted to license belonged to the first founders I had backed. A shipping lane they hoped to use for a splashy pilot ran through the second company I had nursed through a hard winter. A property they loved for a new operations hub was held inside a portfolio whose manager called me on Sundays. It did not make me a puppet master. It made me prepared. The people I had stood beside remembered who answered when no one else did. They took Jason's calls because it was good business, and then they called me because they wanted to know whether the terms were fair. When talk of the engagement filled our inboxes, one of the founders texted to say Atlas wanted a year of exclusive access. He asked if that would hurt a community bank he had promised not to crowd out. I told him to keep his promise and offer a timeline that left room for the smaller bank to breathe. Another wrote to say a team close to Richard Fairchild had pushed for control over product decisions in exchange for a faster check. I told her money that tries to take the wheel on day one is not partnership. She knew it already. She just needed someone steady to say it out loud. I never told any of them to turn away from Atlas. I asked them to choose partners, not owners. Each choice nudged the web a little tighter around the idea that had once tried to squeeze me out. It was not revenge. It was stewardship. I kept my word when I said I would stay out of their photos and be there when the numbers needed a sober eye. I reviewed quarterly notes late at night. I answered honestly when things went wrong, and told them where to cut before it cut them back. When a founder could not sleep because payroll felt like a cliff, I wired a bridge and asked for nothing but a plan. They learned they could trust me. Trust held when the air got thin. What Atlas never understood was that patience is not surrender. While Jason was teaching himself to look like a leader on camera, I was learning how to be one in rooms without windows. While the board worked the phones to impress the Fairchilds, I was working my word so that calls were returned when it mattered. While Charlotte practiced smiling for headlines, I practiced saying no without raising my voice. The result was simple. If Jason pushed on a door, it opened and then it paused. Someone on the other side checked with me. If he tried to grab every inch of a market to look strong, a founder I loved reminded him that strength and greed are not the same thing. If he thought a property was his because he liked how it looked on a deck, a property manager reminded him that a signature mattered more than a photo. The more I stayed quiet, the more that quiet carried its own weight. I did not throw it around. I used it carefully. When a choice would break a promise we had made to people who could not afford another broken promise, I said no and held that line. When a choice would help Atlas serve people without crushing them, I said yes and stepped back. Atlas thought it had found a ladder in the Fairchilds. It did not see that I had been building a floor. The morning after the email, I walked through my day like I always did, and yet everything felt still in a different way. I knew that without my name, the deal would stall, and without my hand, their best routes forward would narrow. I did not need to threaten anyone. The structure was already there. All I had to do was choose when to pull and when to hold. In the end, it was simple. I did not need Atlas to survive. Atlas needed me. Soon, they would feel that truth in the only place they respected, in results that would not arrive on command. I had spent years being told I belonged behind the curtain. It turned out the curtain was a good place to work. The night before the wedding, they gathered us for what they called a family dinner, long table, soft lights, too many smiles for a room that felt this tense. It was staged for the Fairchilds, a promise that everything was under control, that Atlas was steady and the future was bright. I took my seat halfway down, close enough to watch the show, far enough to be forgotten if anyone needed me to be. Waiters poured wine, someone made a toast about love and legacy, and every sentence sounded like a press release. I kept my hands around a glass of water and let the sound wash by. During a lull, my mother leaned across her plate, the pearls at her throat catching the light, and her voice slid under the chatter like a wire. Do not make things harder for your brother. Not tonight. There was no please. There never was. I nodded once, a small movement that did not cost me anything, and watched her pull back with relief she did not try to hide. Jason waited until dessert to corner me. He stood beside my chair as if we were sharing a private joke, and spoke without looking me in the eye. Just sign and stay quiet. That is all we need from you. His tone was almost friendly, the way you talk to someone you think you can manage. I set my fork down and met his eyes long enough to make it clear I had heard every word. I did not argue. I did not explain. I said I will review the final documents and reached for my glass. Across the table, Charlotte listened without listening. Her smile fixed for the benefit of an aunt from her side who asked too many questions. A cousin clinked a spoon against a glass and called for another toast to the bride and groom. A board member raised his glass and said to leadership, to vision, to family. The Fairchilds nodded as if every word had been their idea. No one said my name. No one ever did. A few seats down, a family friend tried to be clever and asked if I was excited to see Atlas take its next big step. I told him I was excited to see good promises kept. He laughed like he understood, but I knew he did not. People who have never been erased cannot imagine what it takes to stand still and not let the room make you small. I felt the old ache try to rise, then settle. My silence held because I chose it, not because I had been pushed into a corner. I let the conversation flow around me as if I were part of the furniture. Jason told a story about a tough quarter he had turned around. The board member added a story about a bold decision he claimed to support. My mother smiled the way she always smiled when Jason spoke a mix of pride and relief. Every laugh sounded a little too sharp, every compliment a little too practiced. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the way Charlotte's hand tightened on the stem of her glass. Each time the word investment came up, but no one looked closely. They were too busy admiring the picture they had painted. At one point, Jason leaned down again and said, "We are counting on you to be reasonable," and I said, "I have always been reasonable," and let the line hang there. He did not hear it the way I meant it. He never did. He squeezed my shoulder like we had reached an agreement and went back to the head of the table where cameras waited for a family photo that would run in the morning. Plates were cleared. Coffee appeared. Someone passed around a guest book for people to write wishes for the couple. I signed my name with a simple line and closed the cover. Across the room, Richard Fairchild spoke briefly with the director from our side. Quiet words behind an easy smile. And when he glanced my way, his face did not change. I gave him the same still look I gave everyone that night. Let them think I was calm because I had surrendered. Let them believe their script would run without interruption. They wanted a silent sister for their stage. I gave them one. When it was finally over and people stood to hug and promise to see each other tomorrow, I took my coat and slipped toward the door. My mother caught my sleeve and said, "Thank you for being good tonight," and I said goodnight, and that was all. Outside, the air felt clean. I walked to the curb and waited for my car with a steady heart. Nothing in that room had changed my plan. If anything, it had made it easier to keep. They had told me again who they believed I was. Tomorrow, they would learn who I actually am. I went home and slept well. The next afternoon, I walked into the ballroom with a steady heart, carrying only a faint hope that this day might be different. And for a moment, the shine almost convinced me it could be because the room was all light and orchids and polished brass, the kind of careful beauty that makes people believe in stories. I moved through it without drawing eyes, the air cool on my arms, the strings rising and falling as if they had been tuned to someone else's joy, and I watched familiar faces tilt toward one another and close their circles with easy laughter that did not make room for me. My aunt glanced up, then let her gaze slide past as if I were a stranger. A cousin gave me a small tight smile and turned back to her glass. A pair of board members nodded over my shoulder at someone more important. Even the staff kind in quiet ways flowed around me, the way water finds a path that does not touch the stone. I kept walking because hope is stubborn even when it is thin, and I told myself that this was just the prelude and that the place they saved for me would be simple and decent, nothing grand, just proof that I still belonged to something larger than my own name. The seating chart stood on an easel near the entrance like a promise of order. A white board with dark ink looping through names and table numbers, each letter a little piece of someone's certainty about where they fit. I scanned it once from top to bottom, then again more slowly, tracing every line with my eyes, and I found Jason and Charlotte at table 1, my mother and the familiar last names. At table 2, the bridal party grouped like a crest at table 3, then friends and neighbours and old teachers, people from the office, people from her side, people I had known all my life or not at all. All of them placed as if this were simple and obvious. My name was not there. I checked the C's and the O's, and even the misspellings I had learned to expect. And still, I did not appear, which made the hope inside my chest bend. in a way that felt familiar. So I stood there and breathed once and set it down before it broke. A planner with a clipboard noticed me hovering and came closer with a quick smile that belonged to a person working a long day, and I said in a level voice that I did not see my name and wondered if there had been a mistake. And she looked at her list and frowned for a second, and then brightened as if she had found something simple. And she said, "Yes, Miss Carter, you are at table 13. I repeated it so I could hear it out loud. Table 13, and the number sat cleanly between us like a coin someone had just turned over, ordinary to her and heavy to me, because I grew up with people who would not live on the 13th floor if they could help it, and who would never choose that number for anything that mattered." She gestured toward the back with a small sweep of her hand and added that it was that way, and I thanked her and stepped aside so the next guest could find their place. I stood for one more breath, just long enough to let the last of my faint hope pass through me without leaving a mess, and then I started walking, feeling the music and the voices and the warm press of the room stay steady behind me as I moved toward the far tables, already knowing what the number meant in this family, even before I saw the chair they had chosen for me. The planner's voice followed me as I reached the back, bright and efficient, "Ah yes, chair number 13, at the kids' table," and the words landed with the clean certainty of a stamp. I turned and saw balloons tied to little chairs, plastic plates stacked beside paper napkins, crayons spread across a runner, small hands reaching for chicken nuggets and cups of juice. My seat waited at the end, a chair a touch too low for my dress, marked with a small card that said 13. For a second, the room narrowed, not from shock, but from the plainness of it, because this was not a mistake, and it was not clumsy planning. It was a message written in bright colours so even a stranger would understand. I took in the details, because details keep you steady when people try to make you small. A boy in a bow tie tapping a fork against his cup, a girl folding a napkin into a crooked swan, a tiny smear of ketchup on the tablecloth near the spot saved for me. I felt the shape of the insult and let it pass through me without leaving a mark on my face. I set my clutch on the table, smoothed my dress, and rested my fingertips on the back of the chair without sitting. Charlotte timed her entrance like a cue. She passed with a small crowd of friends who admired her veil and the way the light found her earrings, and she did not stop. She did not need to, she only let her voice carry just enough to be heard by the tables around us. "She does not run anything. She belongs there." The words were not cruel by accident. They were crafted to sound casual and final, the way people speak when they believe the story is already decided. A cousin near the dance floor looked down and hid a smile. A friend from the office pretended to check his phone. The planner shifted her weight and studied her clipboard as if the paper held a door she could fall through. I turned my head and found Jason across the room. Our eyes met for a thin moment. He let his gaze slide away as if I had never been there at all. My mother adjusted the fold of her napkin and stayed very busy with nothing. The silence of the people who knew me, the people who had taken what I built and used it, that silence cut sharper than Charlotte's line. It said, "We agree." It said, "Stay where we put you." A small hand tugged the ribbon on the balloon tied to my chair and let it bob again, and that little motion grounded me more than any speech could have. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, and I let it return to where it came from. I would not give them the show they wanted. I slid the chair back an inch until it sat evenly on the tile and placed the card that said 13 in a neat line with the edge of the table. I could have laughed if I had been a different person. Instead, I breathed once slow and even and let the room fall back into focus. The quartet kept playing, glasses chimed. The couple at table 1 laughed for the camera. Nothing about this scene would have looked like violence to a stranger, and that was the point. It never does when the weapon is indifference. I thought of the email I was never meant to see. Once she signed she is irrelevant, and understood that this was the picture they planned to use as proof the bright public frame to hold their private plan. I had been erased in boardrooms and headlines and budgets. Today, they tried to erase me in plain sight. I placed my palm flat on the chair and felt the light tremble in the legs from the movement of the children around me. Then, I looked up and found the faces that mattered. A director from our side who had thanked me quietly in a hallway. A vendor I had saved once with a midnight call. A junior analyst who knew who wrote the numbers Jason liked to recite. I let each of them see me standing there, not furious, not broken, simply intact. The shock on their faces told me enough. They knew. They knew this was deliberate. They knew what it meant. And they knew I was the one person in the room they could not afford to treat like an afterthought. I did not sit. I did not speak. I gave them a small calm smile that felt like the first step on a road I had been walking for years. If they needed me to wear this insult so they could believe in their story, I would wear it for a moment, and then I would take the story back. I lifted my clutch, turned away from the small chair with its neat little card, and walked past the families and the flowers and the cameras, past the careful laughter and the practiced joy toward the edge of the room where the noise thinned and the air felt clean. Every step was measured. Every step was mine. They had placed me at the kids' table to make a point. I understood it. I had a point to make too. I reached into my clutch and felt the clean weight of my phone, my hand steady, because the choice had already been made long before the balloons and the plastic plates. I stepped to the edge of the room where the music softened and called the one number that mattered. When the line clicked, I did not raise my voice. Cancel the contract. There was a pause that lasted no longer than a breath. Then a calm reply. Understood. I ended the call, opened my email, and typed a single line to counsel and the deal team that carried my authority. Effective, immediately, I withdraw consent to the Fairchild Agreement. I hit send and watched the small bar move across the screen until it was done. It felt simple because it was. Around me, the violins kept playing and the guests kept laughing, but a seam had opened that they could not see yet. A server near the head table dropped a spoon and stared at the floor as if listening for something. A planner checked her phone and frowned. Two guests at the bar looked down at their screens at the same time, then back up with matching faces that did not know how to pretend. The first ripple reached Jason. His phone lit up, then lit again, and the easy posture he used for cameras fell away. He read the words, once then, twice, as if the message might turn into something he could fix with a smile. Charlotte leaned close and spoke through her teeth. He did not answer because he had nothing to say. He looked for me across the room and found me where I had been all along, standing straight, one hand around a glass of water. Our mother felt it before she understood it. She stiffened in her chair eyes, skimming the room for someone to blame, landing on me, and sliding off again, as if a clean look might set the whole picture on fire. Near the front, Richard Fairchild rose without hurry, adjusted his cuff and spoke a few words to his aide that sent several people moving at once. He did not look at me. He did not need to. Men like him know when a floor has shifted. The chatter grew thin. Laughter shortened into small sounds that died before they landed. I took a sip of water and let the quiet inside me fill the space their noise had held. For years, they had mistaken my silence for weakness. Tonight, they learned it was my weapon. Jason started toward me, then stopped when another alert hit his screen. Charlotte tried to catch the eye of a photographer, and he lowered his camera, unsure of what this moment was supposed to be. A board member, who had once thanked me in a hallway, stood halfway up, then sat down slowly, choosing not to be seen. No one came to my side. I did not need them to. I put the phone back in my clutch, smoothed the fabric at my hip, and looked once at the small chair marked 13 balloons, nodding above it as if agreeing with the choice I had made. Then I walked. Not fast, not slow, just the pace of a person who knows where the door is and what waits on the other side. The air cooled as I crossed the room. A cousin shifted to give me space. A guest I did not know stepped back without being asked. At the threshold, I paused for a single heartbeat, not for effect, but for clarity, and let the truth settle the way dust does when the work is done. 3 words had ended the deal they built this day around. Cancel the contract. The rest would fall on its own. I did not look back. The night outside met me clean and open. I breathed it in and felt nothing but the lightness that follows a promise kept to yourself. I had not raised my voice. I had not begged. I had only decided, and decision was enough. Inside, the ripples would become waves. Phones would ring that no one could afford to ignore. Statements would be drafted and redrafted, and there would be a search for a different ending than the one already written. But the thing about endings is that they happen exactly when they are supposed to, and this one belonged to me. I walked down the steps, the sound of the party thinning behind me, until it was only a dull memory, and I let the city swallow the noise. The future did not feel like victory or revenge. It felt like control returning to its rightful hands. Mine. Inside the ballroom, the first cracks appeared even before I reached the curb. I felt it in the way the music stumbled for half a bar in the hush that follows, when people do not yet have words for what is happening. A server slipped through the doors behind me and stood under the awning with eyes wide as if he had just watched a storm form in a clear sky. I kept walking. By the time I reached the street, a line of black cars had started to pull away from the entrance, and at the centre of it, Richard Fairchild moved with the slow confidence of a man who does not waste language. He adjusted his cuff, spoke to his aide, and left without a toast or a backward look. Inside, guests were already leaning across tables to trade questions they could not answer. I was not there to hear it, but I did not need to be. I have been in enough rooms to know the sound of a story breaking apart. My phone hummed with the first alerts. A director sent a message that began with, "Can we talk?" and ended with, "Please." A vendor I respected wrote back 3 words I had given him once on a hard day we will hold. Then the headlines arrived first from the business wires, then from the feeds that live on speed. Fairchild Capital withdraws from Atlas deal. Atlas stock plunges in after hours. Partners pause, pending clarity. The phrases were clean and sharp, the kind that make people sit up straighter, whether they understand finance or not. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watched a couple leave early with their coats over their arms, and felt a calm I had not known in years wash through me without heat. This was not gloating. It was relief, the kind that comes when gravity is finally acknowledged. Atlas had been leaning on a story that could not stand. All I had done was remove the prop. My phone rang again this time, with Jason's name across the screen. Then again when I let it pass. Then a third time with a number I knew belonged to the board chair. I did not answer. There was nothing to negotiate. A text from a junior analyst said he had always known where the numbers came from and that he was sorry. I told him to keep his head clear and do his work well. In my mind, I could see the ballroom as if I had never left it. Jason trying to gather the room with his hands, the old trick he used when a meeting slid away from him. Charlotte, gripping the stem of her glass until her knuckles went white, hissing questions at him that had no good answers. Their friends looking anywhere else? My mother sitting very straight, as if posture could hold dignity in place. I walked to the corner and watched the city carry on as it always does, when private dramas break open in public. A cab passed, then a bus sighed to a stop, and above it all the night felt clean, as if it had been waiting for this air to clear. Another headline flashed: Atlas faces questions over governance after deal collapse. A reporter I knew by reputation posted a still from the wedding with a caption that said the moment it turned, and though they had no idea what they were looking at, they were not wrong. Then my mother called. I let it ring once because I knew what would be on the other end. Then I answered. Her voice was thin and breathless the way it gets when she is holding back tears and anger at the same time. "Why, Olivia," she said, "we are family." I looked out at the traffic and the glow of a deli sign and said the only sentence that mattered because you put me at chair 13. She was quiet for a long second, and in that silence I heard every small moment that had led to this one, the trophies tucked into boxes, the meetings I was not invited to the public. Thanks that never came the wedding that turned me into a prop for a deal. She tried to say my name again, but could not find the next word. I told her to get home safe and ended the call. My phone buzzed with a dozen more messages that did not change the shape of what had already happened. Partners announced pauses that everyone would read as exits. An anchor on a late show used the word unravelling and did not sound dramatic saying it. I could have gone back inside to watch the performance collapse in person, but I had no interest in their faces as they learned what I had known for a long time. When you build on denial, the fall looks sudden. It is not. It is a slow choice repeated until the floor gives way. I walked past the hotel and turned down a quieter street where the air did not smell like flowers and flashbulbs. I thought about the junior teams who would be worried about rent and the vendors who would brace for late payments. I made a list in my head of who I would call in the morning and what I could do to blunt the harm for people who had never been invited to the head table. Justice does not have to be cruel to be firm. It only has to be clear. Another alert rolled in. After hours, trading widened the drop. The board announced an emergency session. A columnist used the phrase leadership vacuum, and I considered how accurate that was for a company that had never learned to see the person doing the work. I stopped on a corner where the streetlights made a small pool of gold around my shoes and let the sounds of the city settle. The empire they built on my silence was gone, and I had only spoken 4 words: cancel the contract. The rest had fallen under its own weight. I turned toward home with an easy step, and the kind of quiet that comes when a long fight is finally over, not with applause, but with a door closing on a room that never had a seat for you. Weeks later, I stood in my corner office at the Olivia Group looking down at a courtyard where another wedding glowed under string lights, and the sounds rose up as a soft blur that felt far away from the room I had once been forced to sit in. The workday had thinned to a steady hum behind me, the kind of quiet that tells you a team is moving without being pushed, and on my desk the last calls were done. Notes signed a handful of follow-ups, marked for morning, so no one would wake to a crisis. Control did not feel loud anymore. It felt like knowing which levers to leave alone and which to pull with a calm hand. I checked the small list I kept for myself, not because anyone asked, but because this was the point of all of it. The logistics founder would get a milestone payment a week early so she would not have to lay off her night crew. The property manager would have a signed letter to hold a fair rate for a clinic space so the doors would not close on a Tuesday afternoon. The community bank partner would have a revised timeline from a vendor we both cared about, one that kept promises to people who did not have a cushion to fall on. None of those steps would make a headline. They would make rent and payroll and oxygen, which is what real power is supposed to make. I thought about the night of the wedding and the chair marked 13 and realised it had become the last thing they gave me that mattered. It cut through the last pieces of doubt and told me in the plainest way that the only permission I needed was my own. I had spent years being asked to stand behind a curtain so someone else could take a bow, and in that quiet, I had learned how to build in a way that could not be taken from me. A light tap sounded at my door. One of my associates stepped in, young and careful the way people are when they are still learning where their voice belongs. He asked if I ever planned to sit down with my family and make peace. I did not hear judgment in it. I heard concern and the kind of hope people carry before life teaches them what they can and cannot save. I told him the truth without heat. I was not meant to sit at their table. I was meant to build my own. He held my eyes for a moment, nodded once and slipped out, and the door closed on a quiet that felt like respect. I turned back to the glass and watched a photographer pose a couple in the courtyard while the band shifted into a slower song. For a breath, I let myself go back to the 13th chair, the balloons, the plastic plates, the small hands reaching for food that had nothing to do with me, and I felt no sting at all. It was only a picture, now a clear lesson, their final gift. I remembered the people who had called me when it mattered, the founders who kept their word, when no one was watching, the partners who chose fair terms over speed. I remembered the junior teams who stayed late because they cared, not because someone was watching the clock. These were my people, the ones who never had a seat at anyone's head table and did the work anyway, and my job was to make sure they never had to beg for a chair again. I picked up the glass of water on my desk and held it for a second, feeling the cool weight in my hand. Not to them, I said inside, not to revenge, not to a night that is already gone. To clear sight and steady hands. I lifted the glass and drank, and the city lights came into sharper focus, the lines of the skyline laying out a path that belonged to me. I set the glass down, turned off my lamp, and let the office keep its gentle hum as the floor below wrapped up for the night. I had not been meant to sit at their table. I had been meant to build my own. So I locked my office, stepped into the quiet hall, and let that simple truth settle. If you are where I was hurting, in a room that keeps pretending you are not there, hear me. You are not the problem. You are not too much. You are not invisible. You are someone whose worth does not depend on a seat someone else gives you. Leaving a painful table can feel like failure, but it is often the first honest step. You do not have to fix everything tonight. Start small and kind. Breathe in and out until your shoulders drop. Write one page about what hurt and what helped. Drink water and sleep on clean sheets. Take a walk without your phone and feel your feet on the ground. Tell one trusted person the truth and let them tell it back to you. If the weight is heavy, talk to a counsellor or therapist, or join a group where people listen without judgment. Many people use simple habits to heal these days, and they help more than you think. Journaling a few lines each morning to clear your head. Choosing a quiet routine at the end of the day to tell your body it is safe. Practicing a few minutes of slow breathing or a guided meditation when your chest feels tight. Setting one boundary this week and keeping it. Making a plan with a friend to sit for coffee and talk about real things instead of pretending. If money is tight, look for community clinics, peer groups or free hotlines in your area. Healing is not a straight line. Some days you will feel strong, and others you will feel pulled back into old rooms. When that happens, come back to one promise you can keep to yourself. One small, honest act is how you begin again. The people who failed to see you may never understand what they lost, but that does not decide your future. You get to choose what to build. You get to choose who sits with you. And if today all you can do is stand up and step away, that is already a brave beginning. Thank you for staying with me. If this story made you feel less alone, or if you want more moments like this where we tell the truth and learn how to move forward, you are welcome to stay. Follow or subscribe if you want to hear the next story. No rush, no pressure. I will be here building, and I hope you will be too.